Chapter 1. Snowflakes and Secrets. The road twisted like a coiled ribbon, winding its way through snow-blanketed hills that seemed to stretch endlessly. A veil of gray hung over the town of Crystal Ridge, a subtle promise of more snow to come. As the car crawled through the icy terrain, Sophia Winters gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles whitening beneath the faint glow of the dashboard lights. The voice of her GPS crackled, breaking the heavy silence in the car. "Turn left in 500 feet," Sophia sighed, her breath visible in the frosty air, and muttered under her breath, "This better be worth it." She had no idea what she was expecting to find when she reached her late father's inn. Truthfully, she wasn't even sure why she had come in the first place. It had been years since she'd spoken to him, and longer still since she'd visited Crystal Ridge, a town she remembered only in fragments, a place of sugar-dusted pine trees and the faint scent of cinnamon wafting from its little bakery. Back then, it had felt magical. Now, it felt like an obligation she couldn't escape. As the car rolled to a stop in front of the inn, Sophia's breath caught. The Winters Inn, once a beacon of warmth and cheer, now stood like a ghost of its former self. The wooden sign bearing its name was weathered and cracked, dangling precariously on one chain. The windows were dark, and the snow piled high against the door gave the impression that no one had been inside for weeks. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the snow. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she pulled her coat tighter around her body. She'd come prepared for the weather, but nothing could prepare her for the wave of nostalgia that swept over her as she approached the door. She could almost hear her father's booming laugh echoing in the foyer, the warmth of the fireplace melting away the winter chill. But that was a memory of another lifetime. The key turned with a reluctant creak, and the door groaned as it opened. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of neglect. Sophia stepped into the dim foyer, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the faint light that seeped through the grimy windows. She glanced around, her gaze landing on a framed photograph perched precariously on the edge of the reception desk. It was a picture of her father. He stood proudly in front of the inn, a broad grin on his face, his arm draped around the shoulders of a man she didn't recognize. The stranger's eyes were alight with mischief, his smile almost too charming. She frowned, her fingers brushing against the glass frame. Who was he? And why was he in this picture? "You must be Sophia." The voice startled her, and she spun around to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a rugged look that suggested he was more at home outdoors than in. His jacket was dusted with snow, and his boots left wet footprints on the floor. His eyes, a sharp blue that seemed to pierce right through her, sparkled with an energy that contrasted sharply with the dreary surroundings. "And you must be trespassing," Sophia shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. She placed the photograph back on the desk and crossed her arms. "Who are you?" The man chuckled, a low, warm sound that made her bristle. "Name's Ethan Frost. Your dad and I were close." He gestured around the room. "I've been looking after the place since he passed." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Looking after it? This place is practically falling apart." Ethan shrugged, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. "It's been tough keeping things running. Your dad had a lot of plans for this inn. He wanted to make it the heart of the town again." Her jaw tightened. "Well, those plans died with him. I'm here to settle his estate, sell this place, and move on. So, if you don't mind," she gestured toward the door. Ethan didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "Sell it?" he echoed, his tone laced with disbelief. "You haven't even given it a chance." "I don't need to give it a chance," Sophia snapped. "This isn't my home. It never was." Ethan's expression darkened, and for a moment, the air between them grew heavy. Then, just as quickly, his easy smile returned. "Well, you're going to have to deal with me, whether you like it or not. Your dad left me part of this inn. We're partners." Sophia stared at him, stunned into silence. "Excuse me?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her, his grin widening as she unfolded it. Her father's signature stared back at her, alongside legal jargon that confirmed Ethan's claim. The inn wasn't hers to sell, at least, not without his consent. She crumpled the paper in her hand, her face heating with anger. "This can't be legal." "Oh, it's legal," Ethan said with infuriating confidence. "And it's also the best thing that could have happened to this place. I'm not letting you sell it without a fight." Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd come to Crystal Ridge to close a chapter of her life, not to open a new one. Yet here she was, standing in a crumbling inn with a stranger who claimed to be her partner. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Fine," she said finally, her voice steely. "You want to fight? You've got one." Ethan's grin widened, and he extended a hand. "Then let's get to work, partner." Sophia ignored his outstretched hand and turned on her heel, heading toward the stairs. "We'll see who comes out on top," she muttered under her breath, her heels clicking with determination. Behind her, Ethan chuckled. "This is going to be fun." Chapter 2: Footprints in the Snow. The morning sunlight streamed through the frost-laced windows of the inn, casting golden patterns across the dusty wooden floor. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee that tasted faintly of burnt beans. She hadn't slept much. The night had been a whirlwind of unpacking her meager belongings, avoiding Ethan, and trying to reconcile the fact that she was now entangled with a man she barely knew in a place she wanted no part of. Her phone buzzed against the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and sighed. It was an email from her lawyer, confirming what she already knew. The partnership with Ethan was airtight. Her father had been meticulous with his will, and she had no legal grounds to force a sale without Ethan's agreement. "Perfect," she muttered, setting the phone down and rubbing her temples. The kitchen door creaked open, and Ethan sauntered in, his hair still damp from a shower and a smug grin plastered across his face. He carried a plate of toast in one hand and a mug in the other. "Morning, partner," he said, his tone annoyingly chipper. Sophia didn't bother looking up. "Don't call me that. What should I call you then?" He slid into the chair across from her, taking a bite of toast. "Boss? Your Majesty?" "Oh, I know. Queen of Ice." Her eyes snapped up to meet his, a flicker of irritation in her gaze. "You think you're funny, don't you?" "Funny? No. Hilarious?" "Absolutely." He leaned back in his chair, balancing it on two legs, and sipped his coffee. "So, what's the plan for today? Or are you just going to sit here and glare at me all day?" Sophia took a deep breath, willing herself to remain calm. "The plan is to assess what needs to be done to get this place ready for sale." "Sale," Ethan repeated, rolling the word around like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "You're really stuck on that, aren't you?" "Yes, because that's the entire reason I'm here," she snapped. "I have a life back in the city, and it doesn't involve babysitting a broken-down inn or dealing with someone who thinks they're a stand-up comedian." Ethan smirked but said nothing. Instead, he stood and grabbed a clipboard from the counter. "Well, Your Majesty, if you're serious about assessing the place, let's get started. We'll see just how broken down this inn really is." Sophia's curiosity outweighed her annoyance, and she reluctantly followed him out of the kitchen. The main hall of the inn was brighter in the morning light, but the signs of neglect were impossible to ignore. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and cobwebs clung stubbornly to the high beams. The fireplace, once a grand centerpiece, was choked with ash and soot. Ethan handed her the clipboard. "Make a list," he said. Everything you think needs fixing. She took the clipboard and began jotting down notes. The creak of the floorboards beneath her feet accompanied her as she moved through the space, noting everything from the cracked window panes to the sagging staircase. Ethan trailed behind her, occasionally pointing out things she missed or making sarcastic remarks that she did her best to ignore. They eventually made their way outside, where the snow was still pristine, untouched except for a trail of footprints leading to the barn. Sophia paused, her pen hovering over the clipboard. "What's in there?" she asked, nodding toward the barn. Ethan's expression shifted, his usual smirk replaced by something unreadable. "Nothing you need to worry about. That's not suspicious at all," she said, narrowing her eyes. "If we're assessing the property, we need to look at everything, not the barn," Ethan said firmly. Sophia crossed her arms, meeting his gaze head-on. "What are you hiding in there?" "Nothing." "Then why can't I see it?" Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, it's not a big deal. It's just storage. A lot of old stuff your dad didn't have the heart to throw away." Sophia didn't believe him for a second. Without waiting for permission, she marched toward the barn. The snow crunched beneath her boots, the cold air biting at her cheeks. Ethan called after her, but she ignored him, determined to uncover whatever secret he was hiding. The barn door was heavy, its metal latch rusted from years of exposure. She struggled with it for a moment before Ethan appeared beside her, his breath visible in the icy air. "You're really stubborn, you know that?" he said, exasperated. "And you're really suspicious," she shot back. With a reluctant sigh, Ethan helped her lift the latch. The door creaked open, revealing a space that was both cluttered and oddly organized. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, and antique furniture was covered with sheets. But what caught Sophia's attention was the piano in the center of the room. It was beautiful, despite its age. The wood was polished to a soft sheen, and intricate carvings adorned its sides. She stepped closer, her fingers grazing the keys. A memory stirred in the back of her mind, faint and elusive. "Your dad loved that piano," Ethan said softly. "He used to play it all the time. Said it was his way of keeping the inn's spirit alive." Sophia glanced at him, caught off guard by the tenderness in his voice. For a moment, she saw a different side of him, one that wasn't all sarcasm and grins. She looked back at the piano, her throat tightening. "Why didn't he tell me?" she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan didn't answer, and the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. Sophia's fingers lingered on the keys, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this place than she'd been willing to see. Chapter 3. The Winter Stranger. The days in Snorridge had a peculiar rhythm, slow and deliberate, like the steady drip of melting icicles. Sophia awoke to the sound of snowplows clearing the streets and the muffled chatter of locals braving the cold to start their day. Despite the heaviness in her chest, she felt a strange pull to explore the town, to understand the life her father had built here, the life he'd kept separate from her own. Bundled in her thickest coat, she stepped out of the inn and into the crisp morning air. The sky was a pale shade of gray, promising more snow before the day was out. Ethan was already outside, clearing the path leading to the front door. He paused mid-shovel and glanced up at her, his breath visible in the cold. "Heading out?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Sophia nodded, tightening her scarf. "I need some air." "And answers." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing, returning to his task with a shrug. She walked past him, her boots crunching against the freshly packed snow, and made her way toward the heart of the town. Snorridge was charming in a way Sophia couldn't deny, even if she wanted to. The streets were lined with quaint shops and cafes, their windows fogged with warmth and activity. Twinkling lights adorned the lampposts, and wreaths hung on nearly every door. She wandered aimlessly at first, letting the town reveal itself to her, until she found herself standing in front of a small bookstore with a sign that read Whispering Pages. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and the scent of aged paper and cinnamon greeted her. Shelves crammed with books filled the cozy space, and a fire crackled in the corner. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile. "Good morning," the woman said. "You must be new in town." Sophia hesitated. "I'm visiting." Sophia Harrington. The woman's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and her eyes seemed to study Sophia more closely. "Harrington, you say? I knew your father well. He was a good man." Sophia's heart clenched at the mention of him. "You knew my father?" "Oh, everyone knew Robert," the woman said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "He had a way of making people feel like they mattered. Used to stop by here often, picking out books for the inn's little library." Sophia glanced around, imagining her father here, thumbing through novels and chatting with this woman. It was a version of him she'd never known. "Did he ever talk about me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression softened. "All the time. He was proud of you, you know? Said you were doing important things in the city. But he always seemed sad when he talked about it." Sophia's chest tightened, and she quickly changed the subject. "Do you know why he stayed here? Why he bought the inn?" The woman tilted her head, considering the question. This place meant something to him, something he never fully shared. "But if you're looking for answers, you might want to visit the archives at Town Hall. There's a lot of history tied to that inn." The archives were located in a modest brick building near the edge of town. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. A man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses greeted her at the front desk. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking up from a stack of papers. "I'm looking for information about the Evergreen Inn," Sophia said. "And my father, Robert Harrington." The man's brows lifted slightly. "Ah, the Harrington family. Quite the legacy here in Snowridge." He motioned for her to follow him. "Come, let's see what we can find." He led her to a room filled with filing cabinets and shelves stacked with binders. After a few minutes of searching, he pulled out a thick folder labeled Evergreen Inn, Historical Records, and placed it on a nearby table. "Take your time," he said, leaving her to sift through the documents. Sophia opened the folder and was immediately struck by the age of some of the papers. There were deeds, newspaper clippings, and even old photographs. One photo, in particular, caught her attention. A black and white image of the inn, taken decades ago. Standing on the porch was a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to her father. But it couldn't be. The photo was dated 1946. Her pulse quickened as she dug deeper, finding mentions of the inn being uniquely preserved and tied to local folklore about unexplainable phenomena. One article described a storm in 1952 that should have destroyed the building but left it untouched. Sophia's mind raced. What had her father gotten involved in? And why had he kept this part of his life hidden from her? When she returned to the inn that evening, the sky was heavy with snow. Ethan was in the main hall, repairing a loose banister, but he straightened when he saw her. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, setting down his tools. Sophia hesitated, clutching the folder to her chest. "I might have." Ethan frowned, his earlier humor replaced by genuine concern. "What happened?" She glanced around the room, her father's presence suddenly palpable. "Do you know anything about the history of this place? About strange things?" Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might brush her off. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There's a lot you don't know, Sophia. About this inn. About your father. But if you're serious about finding answers, you're not going to like all of them." Sophia's grip on the folder tightened. Try me. Ethan held her gaze, his expression unreadable. All right, but you might want to sit down for this. Chapter 4. Icicles and Innuendos. Snow drifted steadily outside the inn, each flake catching the dim glow of the porch light as Sophia sat by the fireplace in the common room. The warmth of the flames licked at her face, but the chill in her chest refused to dissipate. Ethan had disappeared into the kitchen after his cryptic remark, leaving her alone with a storm of questions. The folder from the archives lay on the coffee table, unopened since she'd returned. She stared at it, willing herself to reach out and dive into its secrets. But the weight of what she'd already uncovered felt suffocating. Why had her father kept all this from her? And why did the man in the photograph from 1946 look so much like him? A sudden clatter from the kitchen broke her trance. She turned just in time to see Ethan emerge, carrying 2 steaming mugs. Hot chocolate, he said, setting one down in front of her before taking the armchair opposite. Thought you could use something warm. Sophia gave him a small nod of thanks, wrapping her hands around the mug. The aroma of melted chocolate and cinnamon filled her senses, but her appetite was dulled by the weight of uncertainty. Are you ready to talk? Ethan's voice was low, cautious. She met his gaze, searching his expression for any sign of deception. Why do I feel like you know more about my father than you're letting on? Ethan's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Because I do, he admitted. But it's not my story to tell. At least, not all of it. Sophia's grip on the mug tightened. Then whose story is it? Because my father clearly isn't around to explain. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the flames. The inn, it's not just a place. It's tied to something bigger, something unusual. A bitter laugh escaped Sophia's lips. Unusual? That's one way to describe a building that somehow survived a storm unscathed and a photograph that shouldn't exist. Ethan's eyes snapped to hers, surprise flickering across his face. You saw the photo? Yes, she said firmly. And I need to know what it means. Why does he look exactly the same in a picture from decades before I was born? Ethan's shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her questions was a burden he'd been carrying for years. There's a lot about this town, about this inn, that doesn't make sense. Not at first. Sophia leaned forward, her frustration bubbling over. Stop talking in circles, Ethan. Just tell me what you know, he sighed, setting his mug down on the table. Fine, but you have to promise not to freak out. I think we're past that point, she muttered. Ethan stood and began pacing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The evergreen inn has a connection to time, not in the way you think. It's more like a tether. People who come here, who stay here, they're drawn to it for a reason. Your father was one of them. Sophia frowned. A tether to time? What does that even mean? It means that this place holds echoes of the past, Ethan said, his voice growing quieter. Sometimes those echoes are so strong, they blur the lines between what was and what is. That's why the inn survived that storm in '52. Why the photo exists. Your father. He was part of that connection. Sophia stared at him, trying to process his words. You're saying my father, what? Time traveled? Lived multiple lives? What are you even saying? Ethan stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression earnest. I'm saying that your father understood the inn better than anyone. He protected it, cared for it, because he knew what it was capable of. Sophia's head spun. None of this made sense. Her father had been practical, grounded, a man of logic and routine. The idea that he'd been tied to something as fantastical as a tether to time felt absurd. And yet, the evidence was piling up. If what you're saying is true, she said slowly, then why didn't he tell me? Why keep it a secret? Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Maybe he was trying to protect you. Or maybe he thought you wouldn't believe him. I can't answer that, Sophia. Only he could. She sank back into the couch, her mind reeling. Protect her? From what? The truth? The inn? Or something else entirely? Later that night, long after Ethan had retreated to his room, Sophia sat alone in the common room. The folder from the archives spread out before her. The photograph stared back at her. The man on the porch a haunting mirror of her father. She flipped through the papers, looking for anything that might provide clarity. Her fingers brushed against a letter tucked into the back of the folder. It was addressed to her, in her father's familiar handwriting. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. The words blurred together at first, but she forced herself to focus. My dearest Sophia, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to explain everything in person. And for that, I'm sorry. There's so much I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how. I hope you can forgive me. The Evergreen Inn is more than just a building. It's a bridge between moments, a keeper of stories that were never meant to be forgotten. And now, it's yours to protect. You'll find the answers you're looking for, but they won't come easy. Trust Ethan. He knows more than he lets on. And trust yourself. You're stronger than you think. With all my love, Dad. Tears blurred her vision as she finished reading. The room felt impossibly quiet, the crackling of the fire the only sound. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. For the first time since she'd arrived in Snorridge, she felt a sense of purpose. Whatever secrets the inn held, she was determined to uncover them. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to reconnect with the father she'd lost. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if urging her forward. Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her resolve solidifying like the ice forming on the eaves of the inn. Tomorrow, she would begin her search in earnest. The answers were here, hidden in the whispers of the past, and she would find them, no matter the cost. Chapter 5. Frostbitten Promises. The morning arrived in pale hues of gray, the sun hidden behind a thick curtain of clouds. Sophia awoke to the muffled stillness of a snow-laden world. The sound of her boots against the wooden floor echoed faintly as she descended the stairs to the common room, the letter from her father folded neatly in her pocket. It felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of unanswered questions and promises unfulfilled. Ethan was already there, seated at the large dining table near the window, his coffee steaming in his hands. His gaze was distant, fixed on the swirling snow outside, but he looked up when she entered. For a moment, their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Last night's conversation hung in the air like frost on a window pane. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep or thought. "Morning," Sophia replied, her tone subdued. She crossed to the coffee pot on the counter, pouring herself a cup. The warmth of the mug against her palms was a small comfort. Ethan broke the silence. "Did you think about what I said last night?" Sophia hesitated, then nodded. "I did, and I found this." She pulled the letter from her pocket and unfolded it, setting it down on the table. "My father wrote it. He mentioned you." Ethan's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he didn't reach for the letter. "What did he say?" "That you know more than you let on," she said pointedly, taking a seat across from him. "So why don't you start talking?" Ethan's jaw worked as if chewing over his words. Finally, he sighed. "There's a lot I could say, but it's not all going to make sense right away. The inn, your father. It's complicated." Sophia's frustration flared. "You keep saying that, but you're not giving me anything concrete. If my father trusted you enough to mention you in that letter, then I'm trusting you to tell me the truth." Ethan set his mug down, his fingers lacing together on the table. "All right, I'll tell you what I know. But you have to promise me you'll keep an open mind." "Fine," she said, though her skepticism was plain. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. Your father and I met years ago, long before you were born. I'd been working here at the inn, fixing things up after it had fallen into disrepair. That's when I started noticing strange things, objects that weren't where I'd left them, guests who claimed they'd seen shadows moving in the halls. At first, I chalked it up to old building quirks. But then your father showed up. Sophia frowned. Why was he here? He said he was drawn to the inn, Ethan said. Something about it called to him. He spent months researching its history, combing through old records, talking to locals. That's when he started uncovering the connection between the inn and whatever it is that ties it to time. And you believed him? Sophia asked, incredulous. Ethan's gaze was steady. I didn't at first, but then things started happening that I couldn't explain. One night, I saw. He paused, his throat working as he swallowed. I saw a woman in the hallway, dressed in clothes from another era. She looked right at me, like she could see me. And then she was gone. Sophia shivered despite the warmth of the room. You think she was a ghost? I don't know what she was, Ethan admitted. But she wasn't the last. Your father believed the inn was a kind of anchor, a place where moments in time overlap. He called them echoes. Sophia stared at him, her mind racing. Could that explain the photograph? The storm? Her father's cryptic letter? If that's true, she said slowly, then what does it mean for me? Why did my father leave this to me? I think he knew you'd be the one to figure it out, Ethan said. He always said you had a gift for seeing things other people missed. Sophia's chest tightened at the memory of her father's quiet encouragement, his belief in her when she doubted herself. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Later that day, as Ethan worked to clear the snow from the inn's driveway, Sophia ventured into the attic. The narrow staircase creaked under her weight, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was dim, lit only by a single bulb that cast long shadows across the room. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their labels faded with age. She began opening them, sifting through old guest ledgers, faded photographs, and brittle letters. It was a treasure trove of history, each item a fragment of the inn's story. In one box, she found a journal bound in cracked leather. The name Josephine Adler was scrawled on the first page, dated 1897. She flipped through the entries, her breath catching as she read about a storm eerily similar to the one in 1952. Josephine described a night of terror as the wind howled and the inn seemed to hum with energy. But the next morning, everything was untouched, just as it had been in her own father's account. Sophia's hands trembled as she closed the journal. Whatever was happening at the Evergreen Inn wasn't new. It stretched back decades, perhaps longer. As she moved to set the journal aside, her fingers brushed against a hidden compartment in the box. She pried it open, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. Inside was a key, its metal tarnished with age. A sense of purpose surged through her as she held it. Somewhere in the inn, this key unlocked another piece of the puzzle, and she was determined to find it. Chapter 6: Cracks in the Ice. The Evergreen Inn stood silent under the weight of the snowstorm. Yet, within its walls, Sophia felt the stirrings of a story long forgotten, one etched into the very beams and bricks of the place. The key she had discovered the night before rested on the nightstand in her room, its cold metal gleaming faintly in the dim morning light. She hadn't slept much, her mind preoccupied with the implications of her findings. After dressing quickly and securing the key in her pocket, Sophia descended the creaking staircase to the common room. Ethan was seated at the table, a map of the inn spread before him, his expression one of quiet concentration. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. "You're up early," Ethan remarked without looking up. "Couldn't sleep?" "Something like that," Sophia replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She hesitated, then joined him at the table. "What are you looking at?" "Blueprints," he said, tapping a finger on the map. "These are from when the inn was built. I thought they might give us some clues about your key." Sophia leaned over the map, her gaze scanning the intricate details. "Did you find anything?" Ethan pointed to a small, unlabeled space on the second floor. "This area doesn't match up with the current layout. It might be a hidden room." Sophia's heart quickened. "How do we get there?" "There's a hallway behind the old library," Ethan explained. "If the blueprints are accurate, there should be a false panel or a concealed door." The hallway in question was dimly lit and narrow, the air heavy with the scent of aged wood and dust. The library's door creaked as Sophia pushed it open, revealing rows of bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Many of the books were covered in a thick layer of dust, their spines faded and cracked. Ethan followed close behind, carrying a flashlight. "It's back here," he said, leading her to the far end of the room. They searched in silence, running their hands along the walls and pressing against various sections of the paneling. After several minutes, Sophia's fingers brushed against a seam in the wood. "Here," she called out, her voice hushed. Ethan shone the flashlight on the spot, revealing a faint outline of a door. "Good eye. Let's see if your key works." Sophia's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the key from her pocket and inserted it into the hidden lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and the panel slid open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "This wasn't on the blueprints," Ethan murmured, his voice tinged with awe. Sophia took a steadying breath. "Let's find out where it leads." The staircase ended in a small, windowless room lined with shelves. Dust hung heavy in the air, disturbed by their movements. The room's contents were a mix of the mundane and the mysterious. Old ledger books, faded photographs, and strange artifacts whose purposes were unclear. Sophia's attention was drawn to a table in the center of the room. On it lay a collection of papers bound together with twine. She picked them up, her fingers brushing against the fragile pages. The handwriting was her father's. "This is his," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Ethan stepped closer, peering over her shoulder. "What does it say?" Sophia began reading aloud. "The inn is alive in ways I cannot fully understand. It remembers. It whispers. The echoes are strongest during the storms, as though the weather stirs something within its walls." She paused, her heart racing. "Echoes, like what you've seen?" Ethan nodded solemnly. "Keep reading. I have found traces of those who came before us, their stories interwoven with the fabric of this place. Some were lost, others found. But the inn keeps them all." Sophia set the papers down, her mind reeling. He knew. He understood what this place was, and he tried to document it. But why? Ethan asked. What was he hoping to accomplish? Sophia's gaze fell on a small, locked chest beneath the table. She reached for it, finding another keyhole. The key from the attic slid in easily, and with a twist, the chest opened. Inside was a collection of letters, each addressed to her. Her hands shook as she pulled out the first envelope. The words on the page blurred as tears filled her eyes. "Sophia," she read aloud, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to guide you. But you don't need me to tell you how strong and capable you are. The inn chose you for a reason. Trust it and trust yourself." The weight of her father's words settled over her like a heavy snowfall. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the chest, her resolve hardening. "We're going to finish what he started," she said, meeting Ethan's gaze. "We're going to uncover the truth about this place." That night, as Sophia lay in bed, the storm raged outside. But instead of feeling fear, she felt a strange sense of connection, as though the inn itself was alive, watching, waiting. And in the silence, she thought she heard it. A whisper, a faint echo of something long past. It sent shivers down her spine and filled her with an undeniable certainty. The evergreen held answers, and it was only the beginning of its story. Chapter 7. Under the mistletoe's shadow. The morning came reluctantly, gray and subdued beneath the remnants of the storm. The once heavy snowfall had dwindled to a light dusting, but the inn seemed to wear the frost like a second skin. Sophia awoke with the unease of a half-remembered dream clinging to her consciousness. Her father's voice had whispered in her sleep, indistinct but persistent, like the wind threading its way through the rafters of the Evergreen Inn. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet meeting the cold wooden floor. The letters from her father lay on the bedside table, their edges frayed from her restless handling. Each word in those letters held weight, pressing on her as though they demanded answers she wasn't yet prepared to give. Downstairs, the common room buzzed faintly with the sounds of life. The hiss of the coffee pot, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional murmur of guests who were finally venturing out after the storm. Sophia descended the stairs, the key she'd found in the attic still cool in her pocket, a small talisman of the secrets she and Ethan had unearthed. Ethan was seated by the fire, his hair slightly tousled, as though he hadn't slept much either. He looked up as she approached, offering a small smile. "Good morning," he said. "Sleep okay?" Sophia shook her head. "Not really." "You?" "Not at all," Ethan admitted, gesturing for her to sit. "I couldn't stop thinking about that room, and the letters. Did you read all of them?" "Not yet," she replied, taking the chair across from him. "But the one I read, it felt like he was speaking directly to me, like he knew I'd be here, finding them, piecing it all together." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "It's strange, isn't it? The way the inn feels almost alive, as if it's guiding us towards something." Sophia's eyes flicked to the fire. "What do you think it wants us to find?" Before Ethan could answer, the front door swung open with a gust of icy air, and Mr. Grayson, the inn's elderly caretaker, stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He carried a bundle of firewood, his face lined with the wear of years spent tending the inn through countless winters. "Morning," Grayson greeted them, his voice gruff but warm. "You two look like you've been up all night chasing ghosts." Ethan chuckled, but Sophia's gaze lingered on the caretaker. "Mr. Grayson, can I ask you something?" He set the firewood down and dusted his hands off on his coat. "Depends on the question," he replied with a wry smile. "The hidden room we found," Sophia began carefully, "and the papers my father left behind. Did you know anything about them?" Grayson's smile faltered, his expression darkening like a cloud passing over the sun. He lowered himself into a chair by the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. "Your father," he said after a long pause, "was a good man, a curious man. But he had a habit of asking questions the inn wasn't ready to answer." Sophia frowned. "What does that mean?" Grayson's gaze fixed on the flames. "This place, it's older than it looks, older than most people think, and it remembers. Your father believed it could tell stories, reveal truths about the people who passed through its halls. But not all truths are meant to be found." The room seemed to grow colder despite the fire's warmth. Ethan leaned forward. "Do you think the inn's dangerous?" Grayson's eyes met Ethan's, their clarity piercing. "Not dangerous. Protective. But sometimes, protection looks like something else entirely." Sophia's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "Did my father know that?" Grayson's expression softened. He knew, but knowing didn't stop him from looking. "And now, it seems you're following in his footsteps." Sophia and Ethan spent the rest of the day poring over the letters and documents they'd found in the hidden room. The papers painted a fragmented picture of her father's research, observations about the inn's history, notes on its architecture, and accounts of strange occurrences witnessed by past guests. One recurring theme stood out: The idea of echoes. It's like he believed the inn was a kind of recorder, Sophia mused, holding up a page filled with sketches and annotations, that it absorbs the emotions and experiences of the people who stay here, and sometimes plays them back, Ethan added, recalling the spectral figure he'd seen in the hallway. Sophia nodded. But why? What purpose would that serve? Ethan didn't have an answer. Instead, he reached for another letter, unfolding it carefully. Listen to this, he said. The inn has a heart, a rhythm. It beats strongest during the storms, as though the weather awakens something within its walls. I fear it is both a gift and a curse. Sophia's breath caught. A gift and a curse, she repeated. What if that's why he stayed here? To understand it? Or to protect it, Ethan suggested. They fell into a contemplative silence, the weight of their discoveries pressing down on them. The inn seemed to hum faintly around them, its presence more palpable than ever. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by something sinister, but by something expectant. That night, as Sophia lay in bed, she turned her father's words over in her mind. The inn had a heart, he'd written, and as she drifted off to sleep, she thought she could hear it, a faint, rhythmic pulse, steady and unyielding, like the echo of a snowflake's fall in the silence of winter. Chapter 8. Whispers Beneath the Pines. The snow outside the evergreen deepened, blanketing the world in pristine silence. The weather had turned bitterly cold, and a biting wind whispered through the cracks of the old building. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low, its embers casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sophia sat at the long wooden table in the common room, her fingers tracing the edges of the letters she had been studying for hours. Ethan entered the room carrying 2 steaming mugs. He placed one in front of her before taking the chair opposite. "Tea," he said with a faint smile. "You look like you need it." "Thanks," Sophia replied, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. The tea's earthy scent mingled with the faint smell of pine wood from the fire. "I can't shake the feeling that these letters aren't just about my father's research. There's something more personal in them, like he left them for me." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "What makes you think that?" Sophia pulled one of the letters from the stack and unfolded it, the paper brittle with age. "Here, he writes about how the storms seem to amplify the inn's presence. He talks about it almost like it's alive. But this line, the snow hides what the storm reveals. It feels like a message, a clue." Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. "Do you think he meant something literal?" "Maybe," Sophia said. "Or maybe it's metaphorical. Either way, it's like he knew I'd be here, trying to figure it out." Ethan's gaze drifted to the window, where the snow continued to fall in a relentless flurry. "If the snow hides what the storm reveals, then maybe we need to wait for the storm to pass." Sophia considered this, sipping her tea. The heat spread through her chest, warding off the chill that seemed to seep from the walls. "You might be right, but while we're waiting, I want to explore more of the inn. There's something here. I can feel it. And I think my father wanted me to find it." The afternoon was spent combing through the inn's many rooms. Sophia and Ethan started in the attic, where they had first discovered the letters. They sifted through boxes of old photographs, journals, and trinkets left behind by previous guests. Each item seemed to carry its own story, a fragment of a life once connected to the inn. Ethan held up a faded photograph of a young couple standing in front of the inn. "Look at this," he said. "Do you think they ever imagined their picture would end up in a dusty attic?" Sophia glanced at the photo. The couple looked happy, their smiles frozen in time. "Maybe they're part of the inn's history," she said. "Everyone who stays here leaves something behind, even if it's just a memory." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they made their way to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of damp stone filled their nostrils. The basement was dimly lit, the single bulb casting long shadows across the uneven floor. Rows of shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of preserves, tools, and other odds and ends. Sophia's breath condensed in the frigid air as she ran her fingers along the shelves. Her hand paused on a small, locked chest tucked into the corner. "Ethan," she called, gesturing to the chest. "Help me with this." Ethan joined her, crouching down to examine the lock. "It's old," he said. "Rusty, but still solid. Do you have that key you found in the attic?" Sophia nodded, pulling the key from her pocket. She slid it into the lock and turned it with a satisfying click. The chest creaked as she lifted the lid, revealing its contents. Inside were more letters, bound together with twine, and a leather-bound journal. Sophia picked up the journal, its cover embossed with an intricate design of snowflakes. She opened it to the first page, her father's handwriting immediately recognizable. "It's his journal," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This might have all the answers." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Take your time," he said softly. "We'll go through it together." Back in the warmth of the common room, Sophia and Ethan pored over the journal. Each entry painted a vivid picture of her father's experiences at the inn. He described strange occurrences, whispers in empty rooms, objects moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. But amid the accounts of the inn's mysteries, there were also deeply personal reflections. One entry stood out. "I came to the Evergreen in seeking solitude, but I found something far greater. This place, it's more than a refuge. It's a mirror, reflecting the truths we try to hide." For Sophia, should she ever read this, trust your instincts. The answers are here, waiting for you. Sophia's heart ached as she read her father's words. He had known she would come here, that she would unravel the threads of his life and find herself entangled in the same mysteries. "He wanted you to finish what he started," Ethan said, his voice low. Sophia nodded, determination hardening her features. "Then that's what I'll do." The fire crackled softly, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, its silence deep and impenetrable. The inn seemed to hum faintly around them, as if acknowledging their resolve. Whatever secrets it held, Sophia knew they were drawing closer to the truth. Chapter 9. The Silent Blizzard. The night had settled over the small town, cloaking everything beneath a blanket of white. Snowflakes continued their graceful descent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Each flake, unique in its design, had its own journey to make, just like the people who lived beneath them. And amidst the swirl of winter's embrace, Carla found herself caught in a quiet moment of reflection. The snow, which had begun falling gently hours ago, had now turned into a full-fledged storm. Yet, here in the cabin, the warmth of the hearth crackled and danced, casting soft shadows on the wooden walls. Chris sat across from her, the space between them comfortable yet filled with an unspoken tension. They had spent the day together, fixing the fireplace, playing cards, and sharing stories of their lives before this unexpected turn of events. With every laugh they shared, Carla felt her walls crumble just a little more. But it wasn't the laughter that held her attention now. It was the steady silence that lingered in the room after the last joke had been told, after the last card had been laid down. Carla shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She glanced at Chris, who was staring into the fire, his expression thoughtful. The flickering light cast a warm glow on his face, softening the lines of worry that had been there since their first meeting. He had told her so little about himself, but she could sense there was more to his story than he let on. She had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his eyes would narrow when the conversation turned toward the future. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It felt like something deeper, a connection that was slowly but surely taking root. "I never thought I'd be stuck here," Carla said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was almost a whisper, as if she wasn't sure whether to disturb the stillness or not. Chris turned toward her, his eyes kind and warm. "Yeah, it's not exactly what either of us had planned." He smiled softly, though there was something lingering behind his expression, something more serious. "But I'm glad you're here, even if it's under strange circumstances." Carla looked away quickly, afraid her emotions would betray her. It was the first time he had said something like that, something sincere, without the playful banter that had been their armor until now. She could feel the weight of his words settling around her, as if they meant more than just a casual remark. "I don't know if I'm glad," she said quietly, her voice betraying the vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to show. "I mean, I'm glad for the time we've spent here, but it feels like I've been running from something for so long." Chris's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "What do you mean?" Carla hesitated, unsure of how to put her feelings into words. She wasn't sure if she was ready to share the weight of her doubts, her fears, with someone who had already proven so much kindness. But something about the way Chris was looking at her, gently, patiently, made her feel as though she could trust him, even with the hardest parts of herself. "I came here to get away from everything," she confessed, her eyes fixed on the fire, as if the flames might hold the answers. "My job, my life. It was all too much. I wanted to get away from the noise, from the people, from everything. But now I don't know what I'm running from anymore. I just feel lost." Chris was silent for a moment, his brow furrowing in thought. Then, he spoke in a low, reassuring tone. "I get that. I mean, not exactly the same, but I understand the feeling. Sometimes it's like the world is so loud, and you just need a quiet place to breathe." He looked at her, his eyes full of understanding. "Maybe that's why the snow is so perfect. It's like nature itself is telling us to slow down, to listen more carefully, to let go of all the things we don't really need." Carla nodded slowly, taking in his words. It was strange, but his insight made her feel lighter. The snow had become a metaphor for her own state of mind, and she hadn't even realized it until now. She had been so focused on the outside world, the demands of her job, the expectations placed on her, that she had forgotten what it meant to simply exist, to feel the quiet rhythm of her own heartbeat. "I think I've forgotten how to listen," she admitted, her voice small, yet resolute. "To myself, to what I need. Everything has been so chaotic." Chris smiled softly. "It's easy to forget, especially when we're constantly surrounded by noise. But you're here now, and you're starting to hear the things that matter. I think that's enough." A wave of gratitude washed over Carla, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Maybe she wasn't as lost as she thought. Maybe the answers she was seeking weren't out there in the world, but within her. Maybe this snowstorm, this unexpected twist of fate, had given her the chance to rediscover who she really was. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "for listening, for being here." Chris's smile deepened, his eyes soft with something tender and unspoken. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad we're here together." There it was again, the unspoken connection that had been forming between them since the first moment they met. It was quiet, fragile even, but it was there, and for once, Carla didn't feel the need to question it. She simply allowed herself to be present in the moment, to let the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the storm remind her that some things were worth holding on to, even if they seemed impossible. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the steady beat of two hearts, finding their rhythm in the midst of it all. Chapter 10. Candles in the Dark. The morning after the snowstorm arrived in silence. The world outside the cabin was a wonder of frozen beauty. A thick layer of snow blanketed the ground, the trees, the rooftops. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape, untouched by time. Carla stood at the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she gazed out at the soft glow of morning light reflecting off the snow. It was as if the entire world had been washed clean, as if everything had been given a second chance. But despite the serenity of the scene, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. The night before, she and Chris had shared a quiet understanding. No grand gestures, no over-the-top declarations. But it had been enough. They had both opened up in ways neither expected, and though neither of them had said it outright, the air between them felt different. There was an unspoken tenderness there now, something raw and real. She hadn't expected to feel this way. Not in this remote cabin, in the middle of nowhere. She hadn't expected to feel anything, really, after months of running from herself. But here, with the snow falling and the fire crackling, she had started to come back to life. And Chris, he was part of that change. In ways she couldn't yet explain, he had become the quiet anchor she hadn't known she needed. But was it too soon to trust these feelings? She had learned to guard her heart, to keep it tucked away behind layers of skepticism and doubt. What if this moment, this connection, was just the result of the storm, the isolation, the magic of Christmas? What if, once the snow melted and reality set in, everything would fall apart? Carla, Chris's voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway, wrapped in a thick sweater and holding a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Her heart skipped, and she found herself smiling before she could stop it. "Morning," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. Chris smiled back, his eyes warm and awake. "I made coffee. Thought you might want some." She walked over, taking the mug from him, their fingers brushing briefly. It was a simple touch, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her that made her pause for a moment. She wasn't sure why it felt so significant, but it did. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. "You're welcome," Chris replied, his smile lingering. He seemed to be waiting for something, a word, a gesture, but Carla wasn't sure what it was. The silence between them stretched, comfortable and easy, like the soft hum of the morning itself. The storm may have passed, but the world was still and hushed. Outside, the snow glistened in the light, as if daring them to venture into it. The world outside felt impossibly beautiful, and for a moment, Carla allowed herself to forget about everything else. The skepticism, the doubts, the reasons she had come here in the first place. She let the beauty of the moment take over, and with it, the feeling that she wasn't so alone anymore. "You know," she said after a long pause, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, "I've never really liked the snow. Too cold, too messy." Chris chuckled softly, the sound like a balm to her racing thoughts. "Fair enough. Most people would rather be inside with a cup of coffee than out in it, especially in a storm." "Exactly," Carla said, her lips quirking into a small smile. "I never understood people who love it, but I guess I've never really taken the time to appreciate it either." Chris tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Maybe the snow's a little like us then?" Carla raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How do you mean?" "Well," Chris said thoughtfully, "the snow doesn't ask to be appreciated. It just is. It falls, covers everything in a blanket of white, and lets the world see it, even if it's not wanted. It doesn't care. It's just part of the world, part of the cycle, whether we notice it or not." Carla found herself caught by the way he spoke, his words oddly poetic and deeply sincere. "And you think that's like me?" she asked, half teasing, half curious. Chris met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I think maybe you've spent too much time hiding from the world, Carla. Hiding from parts of yourself that deserve to be seen. But maybe now it's your time to be." Her heart raced as his words settled deep inside her. She wasn't sure if he meant it in the way it felt, but something about the way he looked at her made her want to believe it. She'd spent so long keeping her distance, keeping herself buried under layers of sarcasm and distance, afraid to let anyone see the person she really was. But here, in the stillness of the cabin, in the quiet of the morning, she felt the weight of his words sink in. It wasn't about the snow. It wasn't about the storm. It was about her. She felt a sudden surge of emotion, a tightness in her chest, and for the first time in ages, she allowed herself to feel it. The confusion, the uncertainty, the warmth that had begun to bloom in her heart. She could no longer pretend that she didn't want something more, something real. She couldn't deny that the connection with Chris, this quiet, unassuming connection, was slowly but surely shifting something inside her. It was like a spark in the dark, something fragile yet undeniable. But the fear still lingered, just beneath the surface. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Carla whispered, her gaze dropping to the coffee mug in her hands. "I don't know if I can trust it." Chris's voice was gentle when he spoke again. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to let it happen." Her heart thudded in her chest, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The walls she had built up for so long, the barriers she had erected to protect herself from pain, began to feel less necessary. Maybe she didn't need to be so guarded all the time. Maybe she didn't need to be perfect. Maybe, just for once, she could simply be. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The silence between them stretched again. But this time it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like something more, something full of promise, of potential. Chris didn't push. He didn't ask her to make any decisions. He simply stood there, a steady presence, waiting for her to find her way. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a soft cascade of white that seemed to fill the world with possibility. Carla took a deep breath, letting the moment wash over her. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe in the beauty of the present. Chapter 11. Shadows on the Hearth. The days seemed to stretch on, each one a quiet rhythm of firelight and snowfall, as if time itself had decided to slow down in the face of winter's grasp. Carla woke each morning to the soft glow of the sun reflecting off the snow, its light spilling through the small cabin's windows, casting a golden hue on the wood. Each evening, the storm outside seemed to grow stronger, the wind howling as if to remind them that winter had not yet finished its work. But within the cabin, the world felt safe, warm, quiet. It was this peace that made the silence between Carla and Chris so profound. Since the night before, the unspoken bond that had begun to form between them had only deepened. Chris, with his quiet patience and gentle understanding, seemed to sense everything she wasn't saying. Every time their eyes met, Carla felt like he was seeing straight through her, into the parts she kept hidden for so long. And strangely, it wasn't terrifying. It was comforting. It was like being held in the softest embrace. Yet, despite the calm, Carla couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that she was standing on the edge of something she wasn't quite ready for. She paced the cabin, her boots crunching on the floor as she moved from window to window, watching the snowstorm swirl outside. The world beyond seemed so far away, so unreachable. In this moment, she was both alone and not alone. The solitude of the storm had a way of making her feel like she was suspended in time, as if the world outside didn't exist anymore. Chris was in the other room, tinkering with some firewood and humming a soft melody. The sound was faint but warm, as if he, too, was wrapped up in the serenity of the cabin, allowing the quiet to surround him. Carla stopped at the window and exhaled slowly, watching her breath fog up the glass. She had come here to escape, to forget about the world that had been too loud, too demanding. But now, the silence felt less like a refuge and more like an anchor, holding her in place when she wasn't sure if she was ready to stay. "Hey!" Chris's voice called from the doorway, breaking the stillness. Carla turned to find him standing there, wiping his hands on his jeans, a small smile on his face. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice calm, understanding. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain the turbulence inside her. "I don't know," she said softly, her gaze drifting back to the window. "It's like I'm waiting for something, but I don't know what it is." Chris stepped closer, his eyes searching hers with quiet curiosity. "Waiting for what?" Carla shrugged, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her chest. "I guess I thought I'd come here and figure things out. I thought the quiet would help me find the answers. But I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I've been running away from myself for too long." Chris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the space between them. "Maybe it's not about finding the answers," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about allowing yourself to let go of the pressure to figure it all out. Just be. Sometimes the answers find you when you stop searching so hard." Carla met his gaze, and for a moment, she saw the sincerity in his eyes. The way he said it, with such quiet certainty, made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite grasp but could feel all around her, like the snow drifting outside. "I don't know how to just be," Carla admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so long trying to control everything, to make it all fit into this neat little box. But it's exhausting. And now, I don't even know where to begin." Chris was quiet for a moment, and then, as if to reassure her, he reached out and gently touched her arm. His touch was light, yet it felt like a promise. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "Not right now. All you have to do is take it one step at a time. And if that means standing still for a while, then that's okay. You're not in this alone." Carla felt a wave of emotion wash over her, threatening to overwhelm her, but she swallowed it back. She wasn't ready to let it all spill out, not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to breathe deeply, letting his words settle in her chest. He was right. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to control everything. But it was hard, this letting go. It was hard to trust that everything would work out without forcing it to. "I'm scared," Carla said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared that if I let go, I'll lose myself. That if I stop fighting, I'll disappear." Chris's expression softened, and he took a step closer. "You're not going to disappear. You're just letting yourself be who you really are. You're not running anymore. You're here. And that's enough." Carla turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, to explain everything that was swirling inside her, but the words were stuck. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of his words. The silence between them grew, but it wasn't heavy. It wasn't awkward. It was filled with understanding, with the unspoken comfort of two people who had begun to see each other for who they truly were. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a gentle reminder of the passage of time. The storm was far from over, but Carla felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The world might still be chaotic. She might still have fears and doubts, but in this moment, with Chris standing beside her, she didn't feel so alone anymore. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Carla asked, her voice hesitant but curious. Chris took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to the window, to the snow falling in soft drifts. "I think about it," he said quietly, "but I don't think about it too much. I think Sometimes we try so hard to control what happens next that we forget to appreciate what's right in front of us. Carla looked at him, her heart thudding in her chest. She could feel the truth in his words, the quiet wisdom in them, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe it was time to stop looking so far ahead. Maybe it was time to simply be. Maybe, for once, she could just let the snow fall and trust that it would lead her exactly where she needed to go. Chapter 12. Shattered Glass Ornaments. The days blurred together, the world outside the cabin a never-ending canvas of white. The storm had become a familiar presence, a constant hum in the background of their lives. But inside, there was warmth. There was stillness. And, somehow, in the midst of it all, there was a sense of peace Carla hadn't expected. Each morning, they had a routine: coffee, a small breakfast, and then time spent in their respective corners of the cabin. Chris would make sure the fire was stoked, then work on a few simple projects, carving small figures out of wood, patching up the door frame, or organizing the stack of firewood he'd brought inside. He worked quietly, content in his solitude. And Carla? She'd sit by the window, watching the snow fall in delicate patterns, her mind drifting in and out of thoughts. Some days they'd talk, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about small things, old memories, what they had for breakfast, and what might happen once the storm passed. But often, it was just the silence between them. And that, too, was comfortable in a way that Carla hadn't experienced before. But today was different. Carla stood by the window once again, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She stared out at the snow, but her mind wasn't on the swirling storm or the beauty of the frozen landscape. Today, it felt like the world was pressing in, urging her to do something, to move forward in some way. The stillness of the cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, was starting to feel like a cage. She set the cup down on the small table beside her and turned away from the window, pacing the room. She could hear the soft crackling of the fire in the background, but it didn't calm her as it usually did. No, today, it only seemed to highlight the restlessness that had been building inside her. Her thoughts were scattered, pulled in so many different directions that she couldn't focus. Something was shifting, but she didn't know what it was. She stopped in her tracks and looked over at Chris, who was sitting at the table, a worn book open in front of him. He didn't notice her at first. His head bent low as his fingers traced the pages, but she knew that he felt her presence. She could always tell when he was aware of her, even when his gaze was elsewhere. "Chris," she said, her voice soft but carrying an undertone of urgency she hadn't intended. "I've been thinking." He looked up from his book, his expression calm, as though he'd been waiting for this moment. "About what?" Carla hesitated for a moment, unsure how to express the unease that had settled in her chest. "About the storm. About everything, really." Chris set the book aside, his full attention now on her. He didn't press her for answers. He didn't rush her. Instead, he waited, his silence a space for her to fill as she saw fit. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. "I think I've been avoiding something. I've been so focused on surviving this, on just getting through it, that I haven't really thought about what happens next, about what I want. What happens when the storm is over?" The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. It was the question she'd been too afraid to ask, too afraid to confront. Chris leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, his expression thoughtful. "What do you want, Carla?" Her heart skipped at the simplicity of the question, the directness of it, as if he was asking her to take control of her own life, to stop letting the world push her around. She stared at him, her throat suddenly tight. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've spent so long running from everything, from people, from myself. I don't know if I even know how to want something anymore." Chris stood up and walked over to her, his movements deliberate, slow, as if he was giving her the space she needed. When he reached her, he stopped, looking at her with that same steady gaze that had come to feel like a safety net. "Maybe it's not about knowing how to want," he said gently. "Maybe it's about letting yourself want something for once. Something real." She swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overflow. Real. That word was like a beacon in the fog. What would it mean to want something real? To stop hiding behind the walls she had built? To stop keeping everyone at arm's length? Her thoughts were interrupted as Chris took a step closer, his presence close but not overwhelming. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm not asking you to figure it out right now. But whatever happens after the storm, after all of this, you deserve to be part of it. You deserve to choose what comes next." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like a burden. They felt like an invitation to let go of the fear and the doubts that had held her in place for so long. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That's okay," Chris replied. "You don't have to be ready, but you have to be willing to take that first step, even if it's small." Carla felt a shift deep inside her, a crack in the wall she had so carefully constructed. The world outside, the snowstorm, the isolation, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was this moment, this conversation, this possibility that was suddenly before her, the possibility of choosing. For the first time in a long time, Carla allowed herself to feel the weight of the future, not as something to fear, but as something to embrace. She nodded slowly, her heart still pounding but with a sense of purpose she hadn't had before. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." Chris smiled, a small but genuine smile, and then reached out, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. In that moment, it felt like a promise that, whatever happened after the storm, she wouldn't have to face it alone. And in the distance, through the window, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, the fire burned brighter. The world outside was still, frozen, but Carla had begun to thaw, one step at a time. Chapter 13. The Frozen Clock. The days after Carla's quiet decision to try felt both slow and fast, like the world outside was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. And maybe it was. Perhaps the storm, too, was simply waiting for a sign. Something to indicate that the world inside the cabin, sheltered from the furious winds and the falling snow, was ready to move forward. The morning sun, though weak and distant, managed to break through the clouds for the first time in what felt like days. It bathed the cabin in a pale light, illuminating the wooden beams and casting long shadows across the floor. Carla woke early, the silence of the cabin pressing in around her, but instead of feeling stifled, she felt a strange sense of calm. She had slept more soundly the previous night, the turmoil of the days before melting away under the weight of her new understanding. But there was something else, too, a feeling that things were beginning to change. The air felt different, as if the storm had cleared more than just the clouds outside. Chris had already risen when she made her way downstairs. He was standing by the window, his back to her, gazing out at the landscape. The soft glow of the morning sun cast a warm hue on his figure, making him seem even more present than usual. She hesitated for a moment, taking in the quiet stillness of the room, before finally speaking. "Good morning," she said softly, not quite sure what she was expecting in return. Chris turned around, his eyes meeting hers with that same quiet intensity. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and steady. "You sleep okay?" Carla nodded, her gaze lingering on him for just a moment too long. "Yeah, I did." Chris gave a small nod, his lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. "Good. I was thinking about making breakfast. "How do you feel about pancakes?" The question was casual, almost as though the weight of the past few days had never existed. And maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time for something simple, something unremarkable and ordinary. Maybe that was where the healing began. "That sounds amazing," Carla said, feeling the first real stirrings of hunger. It had been days since she'd felt the desire to eat anything more than the bare minimum. The comfort of a meal, the companionship of shared moments, was a luxury she hadn't realized she was missing. She crossed the room, settling herself at the small kitchen table as Chris moved around the space. He worked with ease, the kitchen feeling like an extension of him. Every motion fluid, every action familiar. She watched him for a moment, the simple act of preparing breakfast grounding her. It reminded her that not everything had to be complicated, that life could be lived in the quiet moments, in the spaces between words. "I've been thinking about something," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Chris glanced over his shoulder, his brow raised. "About what?" Carla hesitated, unsure of how to frame her thoughts. "I'm not sure what's next," she admitted, her voice small but steady. "But I think I'm starting to be okay with that. I spent so long trying to control everything, trying to make it all fit together. But maybe it's enough to just let things unfold." Chris turned fully toward her, his hands pausing mid-motion as he looked at her. There was something in his gaze, something soft, something that felt almost like relief. "I think that's a good place to be," he said, his voice steady but filled with understanding. "Sometimes we don't need all the answers right away. Sometimes just living in the moment is enough." Carla's heart fluttered slightly at his words, a mix of emotions rising within her. There was something about his presence, something about the way he spoke, so grounded and calm, that made her feel safe. She couldn't explain it, but she didn't need to. For once, she didn't need everything to make sense. "You're right," she said, the words tasting like freedom. "It's just, I think I needed to stop being afraid. Afraid of what could happen, afraid of what I might lose. But now it's different." She paused, watching as Chris returned to cooking, his movements effortless, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The sound of the batter hitting the pan, the faint sizzle as it began to cook, was soothing. And yet, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting for her, waiting for both of them. The storm, the isolation, the quiet, none of it felt like an accident anymore. It was as though everything had led to this moment, this realization that she didn't have to do it alone, that the fear and uncertainty she'd been carrying could be put down, just for a while. Chris finished cooking the pancakes and set the stack on the table in front of her. He poured syrup into 2 small bowls and placed them beside the plate. She looked up at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks," she said, the simple gratitude in her words feeling more real than anything she'd felt in a long time. "You're welcome," he replied with a smile of his own. "We don't have to make things complicated." Carla nodded, her hands instinctively reaching for the syrup. For the first time in days, she felt the hunger for more than just food. She felt the hunger for life, for the simple moments, for the things that didn't have to be explained or controlled. It was strange, this feeling of freedom, but it was exactly what she needed. They ate in silence, the clinking of forks on plates the only sound between them. There was a sense of peace in the room, the kind that only came when 2 people, once strangers, started to find something real beneath the surface. Something steady, something that didn't need to be perfect to be right. When they finished, Carla leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the moment. She had made a decision, but it wasn't a decision she'd made in haste. It was the beginning of something new, something she wasn't quite sure of, but something she was willing to embrace. She didn't have to know everything, not yet. "Chris," she said softly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence, He looked up from cleaning the dishes, his hands paused, waiting for her. I think I'm ready to face whatever happens next. I'm ready to move forward. With you. The words felt right as they left her mouth, and the weight that had been pressing down on her heart seemed to lift. There was no fanfare, no grand gesture, just the quiet understanding that they had both reached this moment together. Chris set the dishes down and stepped over to her, his gaze soft. He didn't say anything at first, but as he knelt down beside her, he took her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding. He didn't need to speak. His presence said everything. And in that quiet moment, as the world outside remained buried beneath the snow, Carla knew that whatever happened next, she was no longer alone. The storm might still rage, but it was no longer the most important thing in the world. Chapter 14. The thaw begins. The days that followed were filled with a stillness that almost felt too perfect to be real. The storm had finally begun to show signs of relenting, the heavy clouds breaking apart, revealing patches of blue sky that seemed to shimmer like a hidden treasure. The snow, which had once been a wall surrounding the cabin, now lay like a blanket, soft and unassuming, no longer fierce but gentle in its embrace. Inside, the atmosphere was much the same. There was a new rhythm between Carla and Chris, one that felt comfortable, natural, and yet, beneath the ease, there was something new growing between them, an unspoken connection that neither of them fully understood but both felt deeply. The distance that had once separated them was now measured in moments of shared laughter, lingering glances, and the quiet comfort of simply being near each other. Carla had begun to open up in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each day, she found herself talking more, not just to Chris, but to herself, about the things she had hidden away for so long, the thoughts that had been too painful to voice. It was as if the silence of the storm had created space for her to breathe, to think, and to feel without the constant weight of judgment or expectation. She had stopped running from herself. Chris, too, had changed. The weight of the past seemed to lift with every passing day, though he had never been one to dwell on it. His eyes, once filled with a quiet sadness that had taken years to erase, now held a warmth that Carla couldn't ignore. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but somehow, together, they felt like a whole. On the morning of the 5th day since the storm had begun to break, Carla found herself standing in front of the cabin's door, staring out at the world beyond. The snow was still thick on the ground, but the air felt different, crisp, fresh, almost inviting. There was something in the way the sunlight reflected off the icy surface that made the world feel new again, as if everything that had been hidden was now slowly being revealed. Chris appeared beside her, stepping quietly out of the house, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. His presence was a comfort, the sound of his steady breathing a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. "It's almost over," Carla said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon.
"The storm."
Chris nodded, his gaze following hers as the wind gently picked up the snow, sending it swirling in tiny eddies around their feet. "Yeah," he replied. "Looks like we'll be able to leave soon. At least for a while." Carla's heart sank at the thought. As much as she had longed for the storm to end, the idea of stepping back into the world outside felt daunting. It wasn't just the cold weather, or the fact that they had been isolated for so long. It was the simple reality that the storm had given them the time and space they needed to face things they hadn't been ready to face before. Outside the walls of the cabin, life would resume as it always had, and that sense of timelessness that had wrapped around them so carefully would unravel. "Do you think? What happens after?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Once the storm clears, once we leave this place?" Chris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the small pile of firewood near the cabin's edge, picking up a log with ease and stacking it carefully on top of the others. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful, quiet. "I think we do what we've been doing," he said. "We take things one day at a time." Carla watched him, the sincerity in his voice resonating deeply with her. It was simple, but it was true. She didn't need grand gestures or sweeping promises. She just needed to be able to move forward, one step at a time, in whatever way felt right. "I don't know if I can go back to everything," she said, the weight of her words surprising her. "I don't know if I'm ready to face it." Chris turned to her then, his expression steady, calm. "You don't have to be ready right now, and you don't have to do it alone." There it was again, the warmth in his words, the understanding that seemed to radiate from him without question. It was as if, in the quiet of the storm, he had learned how to be exactly what she needed, without her ever having to ask. He didn't push her, didn't expect anything from her. He simply offered a hand, a gesture of reassurance in the face of her doubts. Carla swallowed hard, her emotions rising to the surface. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through the storm, that she had forgotten how to let herself just be. The weight of the past, of everything that had brought her to this point, still lingered, but for the first time, it didn't feel like something that had to control her. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris stepped closer, his presence warm and solid next to her. He didn't say anything at first, but his hand, gentle and reassuring, found hers. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the world outside still holding its breath, as if waiting for them to make a decision, to choose. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," Chris said, his voice steady and full of understanding. "One step at a time, remember?" Carla closed her eyes, the storm inside her finally beginning to quiet, just as the storm outside had done. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to know what would happen next, or what the future held. But in this moment, with Chris by her side, she realized that it was enough to simply take the next step, whatever that step might be. When she opened her eyes, the sun had broken through the clouds completely, casting a golden light across the snow-covered world. The storm was over, and while it had left its mark, it had also opened up something new, something tender, something full of possibility. Carla squeezed Chris's hand, feeling the warmth of it, the promise of something beyond fear. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. "Let's go outside," she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. "Let's see what's waiting for us." Together, they stepped out into the snow, the world feeling vast and wide, but no longer something to fear. And as they walked side by side, Carla realized that the quiet of the storm had been more than just the absence of noise. It had been the space where they had both begun to find the strength to move forward, one step at a time. Chapter 15. Embers in the Snow. The cabin was quiet, its wooden beams heavy with the weight of all the thoughts and feelings that had been shared between the walls over the past few days. The storm, which had once raged like a beast outside, was now a distant memory, a whisper of what had been. The world beyond the cabin had changed, too. The snow, once thick and relentless, had begun to melt, leaving behind a landscape that seemed almost unrecognizable in its calm. Carla stood at the window, looking out at the clearing skies. The storm had broken, but something else had shifted within her as well. The weight that had once pressed heavily on her chest had begun to lift. Each day, with each conversation, each glance exchanged between her and Chris, she felt more and more like herself again. The snow, though still present in patches across the ground, no longer held the same power over her. It was no longer an obstacle, a wall between her and the world. It was simply part of the world, one of many things that made up the landscape. It was a reminder that seasons changed, that things could be both cold and beautiful, harsh and gentle. And sometimes it took a storm to make the beauty clearer. Chris appeared in the doorway, his presence steady and calm as always. He had been quieter the past few hours, as if the shifting of the world outside had matched the quiet changes inside him as well. The two of them had been moving in sync, each of them carrying the weight of their own journey, but slowly, inevitably, weaving their stories together. There was no need for words now, just the simple knowledge that they had both been changed by the storm, by the time spent in isolation. "Ready to head out?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with that same warmth she had come to rely on. The offer wasn't urgent, just a gentle invitation. Carla turned from the window, her heart lifting at the thought of stepping outside. She nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I think I am." They both gathered their coats, the cold air outside still a reminder that winter hadn't fully relinquished its grip on the land. But even so, the promise of something warmer, something new, lingered in the air. The door creaked open as they stepped outside, the crisp air rushing to meet them. For a moment, the cold took her breath away, but the beauty of the world outside immediately swept it all away. The trees, once heavy with snow, were now bare and quiet, their limbs stretching toward the sky as if welcoming the sunlight that poured from above. The mountains in the distance stood proud and strong, their tops still dusted with snow, but their slopes revealing the first hints of green. Carla and Chris walked side by side, not speaking, but not needing to. They were simply present, simply existing in this moment, this peaceful moment that had been years in the making. Carla felt the weight of the past still lingering, but it didn't feel so overwhelming anymore. She could breathe again. As they walked through the woods, the world around them seemed to open up, revealing the hidden beauty of the landscape that had been shrouded by the storm. The ground, once frozen and solid, was now soft, the first hints of new life beginning to show in the form of tiny buds and shoots poking through the snow. The forest was alive again, and so was she. They stopped by the small clearing they had discovered earlier in the week, a quiet place hidden away from the world. It was the perfect spot, peaceful, serene, untouched by anything that had happened in the cabin or the world beyond. Here, there was only the present. Chris looked over at Carla, his eyes searching hers as if asking a question without speaking. She met his gaze, the connection between them undeniable. The quiet understanding that had grown between them over the past few days was more than words could ever express. "I've been thinking," Carla said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had been when they first arrived. "About what happens next." Chris didn't interrupt, his gaze never leaving her face. "I don't know exactly what the future holds," she continued, taking a deep breath, "but I think I'm ready to find out. With you." There was a softness in his smile, something tender and quiet, as though he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. "You don't have to know it all right now," he said, stepping closer to her, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Carla felt a rush of warmth in her chest, the simple promise of his words filling her with a quiet joy. It wasn't about the grand gestures, the promises of forever. It was the assurance that, for now, they were enough. Together, the two of them stood there in the clearing, the air between them thick with unspoken feelings. The world around them felt still, but it was a stillness that didn't weigh them down. It was a stillness that allowed them to breathe, to be, to exist in this quiet moment together. Carla took Chris's hand, her fingers wrapping around his. There was something comforting about the way they fit together, like two pieces of a puzzle finally finding their place. The cold of the day was nothing compared to the warmth she felt in his touch. It was a warmth that came from within, a warmth that made the world seem a little less cold, a little less uncertain. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" she asked softly, her gaze on the ground beneath their feet. Chris squeezed her hand, his voice a quiet promise. "Yeah, we are." The words hung in the air between them, and Carla felt a sense of peace settle over her, a peace that had eluded her for so long. The storm had passed, the world outside was changing, and in this moment, she was ready to step into it, step into whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to face the world by herself. As they turned and began to walk back toward the cabin, the sun breaking through the trees, Carla felt the promise of spring, the promise of new beginnings. It wasn't just the earth that was thawing. It was her, too. And with Chris beside her, there was no doubt in her mind that the world, with all its uncertainty, was finally starting to feel like a place she could call home. Chapter 16. The Winter Waltz. The early morning light filtered softly through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The world outside felt different now, lighter, as though the very air had been cleansed by the storm that had passed. It wasn't just the weather that had changed. Something within Carla had shifted as well, a sense of readiness that had been missing for so long. She stood at the cabin's window, her breath fogging up the glass as she watched the soft glow of dawn break across the horizon. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with gold and pink, as if the world itself was waking up from a long, cold sleep. It was beautiful, but there was something even more beautiful about the stillness in her heart now. A quiet peace she hadn't thought possible. The past few days had been filled with moments of discovery. They had shared more than just their time. They had shared their stories, their hopes, their fears. And in return, they had found something in each other that was impossible to ignore. Carla's fingers rested on the windowsill as she thought about the future. The world outside still held its challenges, her job, the life she had built in the city, the doubts that lingered in the back of her mind. But for the first time in a long time, those doubts didn't seem so insurmountable. The answers weren't clear yet, but they didn't need to be. The path ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was one that she was no longer afraid to walk. Behind her, she heard Chris's footsteps on the wooden floor, the familiar rhythm of his movement that had become a constant in her days. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway, his eyes soft and filled with that same quiet understanding that had anchored her through the storm. He was holding 2 cups of steaming coffee, a gesture so simple, yet somehow it spoke volumes. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. Carla smiled and took the cup from him, the warmth of it seeping through her fingers. She didn't say anything at first, simply taking a sip and savoring the familiar taste. There was something grounding about the routine of sharing a moment like this, something that made the future seem a little less daunting. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice full of quiet gratitude. She had learned not to take moments like this for granted. Chris sat down beside her, his presence a steady comfort. They both looked out the window together, watching as the world began to wake up. The light was growing stronger now, turning the snow into something almost magical, as if the world itself was bathed in a soft glow that made everything feel possible. "I've been thinking," Carla said after a moment, breaking the comfortable silence. She hesitated, as though testing the waters of her own thoughts before voicing them aloud. "About what comes next, about how we move forward from here." Chris didn't rush to respond. He simply sipped his coffee, his gaze still fixed on the view outside, as though letting her words settle before answering. "I think we keep going," he said finally, his voice steady but gentle. "One day at a time. We don't need to have it all figured out, Carla. Not yet. We've got time." His words felt like a balm to her weary heart. She had spent so much of her life trying to plan for the future, to control every aspect of it. But with Chris beside her, she had come to understand that sometimes the best thing you can do is let go of that need for certainty. The future would come, whether they were ready for it or not. But for now, they had this moment. They had each other. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Carla said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Chris turned to her, his eyes soft with something deeper than just affection. "You would have made it. You always do. But I'm glad I was here." Her heart swelled with emotion at his words, and for the first time in a long time, Carla allowed herself to feel something other than fear or doubt. She felt gratitude, yes, but she also felt hope. Hope that whatever lay ahead, she wouldn't have to face it alone. They sat in silence for a while longer, simply drinking their coffee and watching the world outside transform. The light was becoming more golden now, the last traces of night giving way to a new day. It felt like the beginning of something. A new chapter not just for them, but for the world they would build together. After a while, Carla stood up, setting her empty cup down on the windowsill. She turned to Chris, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Come on," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Let's go outside. I think it's time to take the first step." Chris stood as well, his smile matching hers, and together, they stepped outside into the cool morning air. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, a reminder of the connection that had grown between them. The world outside was vast and full of possibilities, but it didn't feel overwhelming anymore. It felt like something they could face together, one step at a time. And as they walked through the quiet woods, Carla couldn't help but feel that, in the stillness of this moment, they had found something more lasting than just the promise of a new day. They had found a new beginning. The snow, once a barrier between them and the world, now seemed to welcome them forward, its icy surface giving way to the warmth of a spring that was just beginning to take shape. In that moment, Carla realized that sometimes the harshest storms gave birth to the most beautiful things. And with Chris by her side, she felt ready to embrace whatever the future held. Together. Chapter 17. Echoes of the Past. The days that followed their walk in the woods were filled with a sense of quiet anticipation. The snow, once thick and suffocating, had melted away almost overnight, leaving behind patches of soft earth that smelled of life, new growth, fresh air, and the promise of what was to come. It was as though the world itself was breathing again after the long silence of winter. Carla found herself in a state of delicate balance, like a flower on the verge of blooming. There was so much to figure out, so many unknowns swirling around her like the autumn leaves that would one day fall. But in the soft presence of Chris, she found herself believing that everything could wait, that they had time to understand, to move forward, without rushing into the future too quickly. It wasn't that the past was behind her. It would never be, not entirely. But each moment spent with him made it a little easier to move away from the heavy shadows of her life before. Every smile, every touch, every shared glance was a thread that pulled her from the past into a present filled with warmth and possibility. It was on one of those golden mornings, with the sun rising higher in the sky, that Carla realized something important. She wasn't just living day by day anymore. She was learning to trust again. To trust in herself, in her decisions, and in the people she let close. And, most of all, she was learning to trust in Chris. They spent the days working together, preparing the cabin for the departure that was inevitable. The road ahead was calling them, but the place they had shared these past few days, this cabin in the woods, held a sacred significance for them. It had been more than just a refuge from the storm. It had been the place where they had learned each other's hearts, where the storm outside had matched the storm inside Carla, and where, through every quiet conversation and every shared meal, they had forged a connection stronger than she could have ever imagined. As they gathered their things, preparing to leave behind the safe, secluded cabin, Carla couldn't shake the feeling of nostalgia that settled deep within her chest. It wasn't sadness, but a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the way this place had healed her, for the way Chris had healed her, even without realizing it. "You know, I think I could get used to this," she said, her voice light but filled with a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. She was standing outside the cabin, looking around at the familiar landscape one last time. Living out here, I mean, it's so peaceful. Chris was behind her, loading the last of their belongings into the car. He paused for a moment, then turned to her with that familiar, gentle smile. "I think I could too," he said, his voice quieter now, as though he, too, understood the weight of what they were leaving behind. "But we've got a lot of the world to see, and I think it's time to go back." Carla nodded, the quiet certainty in his voice reminding her that they couldn't stay here forever. The real world was calling them, and it was time to face it. But somehow, it didn't seem as daunting as it had before. The past few days had given her the courage she needed to take the next step. As Chris finished packing the car, Carla stood for a moment, taking one last look at the cabin, at the clearing, and at the woods that had been their home for these past few days. It wasn't just a place, she realized. It was a memory, a place where they had both changed, where they had learned the most important lesson of all, that even the coldest storms could lead to the brightest of spring mornings. "Ready?" Chris asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Carla turned to him, a smile forming on her lips. "I'm ready." Together, they climbed into the car, and as the engine roared to life, Carla felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. It wasn't the same kind of excitement she had once felt when she was chasing after a story, after a career, after something she thought she needed. This was different. It was quieter, deeper. It was the excitement of knowing that the future wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace, something to face together. The drive back to the town was slower than Carla had anticipated. There was no rush anymore. The city, the people, the life they would return to, were all waiting for them. But it was the journey itself, the way they drove side by side in the quiet of the car, that felt significant. As they passed through forests and fields, past streams and small villages, Carla realized that she wasn't just driving back to the life she had left behind. She was driving forward, into the unknown, with Chris beside her, and that made all the difference. When they reached the small town at the edge of the woods, Carla felt a strange tug of familiarity. It wasn't her home, but it had become a place where she had learned something important about herself. And now, as they entered the town and the road stretched out before them, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. Chris glanced over at her, as if reading her thoughts. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft and full of concern. Carla smiled, her heart light. "Yeah, I'm good. I think I'm ready for whatever comes next." And in that moment, as they made their way toward the horizon, Carla knew that the future didn't need to be figured out today. It would come, just as the seasons came, bringing with it both challenges and beauty. What mattered now was that she wasn't facing it alone. She had Chris by her side, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. They passed the last few houses of the town, the road ahead stretching out toward the unknown, and Carla felt a quiet joy settle in her heart. The world was vast, and their story was just beginning. And this time, she was ready to face it, one step at a time. Chapter 18. A Single Snowflake's Chance. The town, once a distant backdrop to the life Carla had left behind, now felt like a familiar companion, a place that had woven itself into the fabric of her new beginning. As she and Chris walked through the quiet streets, the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, a promise, a shift, a new chapter to unfold. It was early morning, and the light was just beginning to stretch across the sky. The streets were still quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or or the soft footsteps of someone starting their day. Everything felt more intimate now, as though the town had become a part of their story, and they, a part of its. Carla's fingers brushed against Chris's as they walked, the simple touch sending a quiet thrill through her. It wasn't just affection she felt in that moment. It was a deep sense of connection, of understanding. They had been through so much together, and yet, this was just the beginning. They were walking forward, into a future that was still unknown, but somehow, that unknown felt less daunting now. As they passed the local cafe, the same one Carla had visited in her earlier days in the town, she paused for a moment. She had memories of sitting here alone, watching the world move around her as she kept herself at a distance. It felt like a lifetime ago now. The woman who had sat there back then, skeptical and uncertain, was a different person than the one standing here today. The woman standing here now was ready to embrace whatever life had in store, ready to take the leap into a future full of possibility. "You thinking about going inside?" Chris asked, his voice gentle, as though sensing the shift in her thoughts. Carla smiled, her gaze softening. "I think I'm ready for a new beginning," she said, her words carrying a weight she hadn't expected. "Maybe it's time to stop running from the things that scare me." Chris nodded, his eyes steady, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, letting the world continue to unfold around them, as if nothing else mattered except the space they occupied together. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "You've come a long way." Carla's heart swelled at his words. She had come a long way, not just physically, but emotionally. She had shed the layers of doubt and fear that had once kept her from truly living, and now she was standing in the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. They entered the cafe, and the warmth of the space enveloped them. The familiar scent of coffee and baked goods filled the air, and Carla couldn't help but feel a small surge of excitement. This place, once just a stop along her journey, now felt like home, a part of the life she was ready to build, not alone, but with Chris by her side. The barista behind the counter smiled as they approached, and Carla found herself smiling back, her nerves slowly easing with each passing moment. It wasn't just the comfort of the cafe, though. It was the comfort of knowing that she wasn't running anymore. She wasn't running from herself, from her fears, or from the possibility of happiness. "2 coffees, please," Chris said, his voice warm and easy, just like the way he made her feel. As they waited for their drinks, Carla's eyes wandered to the small table by the window, the one she had sat at so many times before. The memories came rushing back: loneliness, skepticism, the weight of expectations. But now, sitting with Chris, those memories felt distant. They were a part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She had written a new chapter, one filled with trust, love, and the courage to embrace whatever came next. Their coffees arrived, and they sat down by the window, the sunlight streaming through and casting a golden glow over the table. Carla wrapped her hands around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into her skin. She looked at Chris, who was gazing out the window, his expression soft and content. He was here, with her, and that was enough. "I've been thinking," she said after a long pause, her voice quieter than usual. "Maybe it's time for me to write that story I've always wanted to write." Chris turned to her, his eyes lighting up with interest. "What story?" "The one about real life," Carla said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "About what it really means to love and to live, without all the filters or the expectations. About the messiness and the beauty of it all." Chris smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "I think you're more than ready to tell that story." Carla's heart fluttered with the truth of his words. It wasn't just about the book anymore, it was about her choosing to live the life she wanted, not just the life she thought she was supposed to live. And with Chris by her side, She felt a confidence she hadn't known before. As they sat in the cafe, the world outside moving steadily forward, Carla realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for. It wasn't a grand gesture or a momentous occasion. It was something quieter, something more subtle. It was the moment when she had finally allowed herself to be open to the future, to trust in the love she had found, and to embrace the unknown with open arms. "Here's to new beginnings," Chris said, raising his coffee cup with a smile. Carla clinked her cup against his, her heart full. "Here's to new beginnings." And as they sat there together, in the warmth of the cafe, surrounded by the soft hum of life going on around them, Carla knew that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to be embraced, to be lived, to be shared with the person who had made her believe in the beauty of it all. Together. Chapter 19. Footsteps Toward Forever. The days that followed their decision felt like a delicate unfolding, a slow but steady walk towards something new and beautiful. Carla and Chris didn't rush. They didn't need to. Every moment felt like a small miracle, every touch, every word exchanged between them, an affirmation of the path they had chosen to walk together. As Christmas drew nearer, the town seemed to come alive with the spirit of the season. Lights twinkled in the trees, the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air, and the townsfolk bustled with a contagious energy, preparing for the holidays. But for Carla and Chris, the magic was different. It wasn't in the decorations or the presents or the hustle of the holiday season. It was in the simple, quiet moments they shared. The walks through the snow-covered streets, the way Chris would reach for her hand as if he couldn't bear to let go, the laughter that flowed so freely between them. They had begun planning for the future, small steps at a time. They visited local shops together, searching for the perfect ornaments to decorate the town's Christmas tree, each one chosen with a shared smile and a sense of anticipation. It felt like they were creating their own little world, separate from everything else. A world where love was real, where trust wasn't a distant hope but a living, breathing thing between them. One evening, after spending the day with the town's annual Christmas fair, Carla found herself standing in front of the cafe where everything had started. It was still as warm and inviting as it had been the first time she'd stepped inside, but now, as she looked at it, it felt like the start of something even more profound. Chris caught up with her, his hands stuffed in the pockets of his coat. "This place," he said, his voice soft. "It's where we first started, isn't it?" Carla smiled, turning to face him. "Yes. Funny how it feels like a lifetime ago. I was so unsure of everything back then." Chris tilted his head, his eyes thoughtful. "It's amazing how much changes in such a short time. I never imagined that I'd be here, right here with you, making plans for a future I used to be afraid of." He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. We've got each other." Her heart swelled with affection, and she squeezed his hand. "I know. I never thought I could love this way again. And yet, here I am." They stood there for a long moment, simply looking at each other. The world around them seemed to fade away, the quiet street, the distant laughter of children playing in the snow. All of it seemed to blur as if the only thing that mattered was this moment. The way their hearts beat in unison, the way their love filled the space between them. Later that evening, they found themselves back at the cabin, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The snow had started to fall again, the flakes twinkling like stars in the cold night air. As they sat together on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, Carla's thoughts drifted to the future. A future that was no longer just a distant hope, but a living, breathing reality that they would shape together. "What do you think life will be like for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris turned to her, his expression tender. "I think it'll be full of moments like this. Quiet, simple, but filled with meaning. And when we look back, We'll see how it all led us here, to each other. Carla smiled softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. I think I'm ready for that. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. The uncertainty that had plagued her for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. This was where she was meant to be, with Chris, with love, and with the promise of a future that, though still unfolding, was more beautiful than she ever imagined. As they sat there, the world outside frozen in winter's embrace, Carla and Chris knew that their journey together had just begun. And whatever challenges or joys lay ahead, they would face them as one, together.